Welcome to the Mind Your Career webinar series. My name is Rachel Burkhan-Rommelfanger, and I work with the Alumni Career Development Team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. And I am delighted to welcome you today to our webinar entitled The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and the Terrific of a Foreign Service Career. Today's speaker is Ambassador Emil Skodon, who boasts that 2 generations of his family are University of Chicago College alumni, both himself and his daughter. The ambassador served in the Foreign Service for 31 years before retiring, and he may be one of the only people who personally experienced both the Iraq invasion of Kuwait in 1990, when he was assigned to the embassy there, and the Al-Qaeda attack on the Pentagon in 2011, when he was on detail to the Air Force and working in the Pentagon. He also, even though he's a world traveler, he is a boy with roots on the south side of Chicago. He was a White Sox fan, and he still has the program from a 1959 World Series game that he attended at the old Comiskey Park when he was just a kid. So with that, now that we know a little bit more about the ambassador, I'm going to welcome him to the line and ask him to take over the controls of this webinar.
Well, thanks very much, Rachel. I appreciate that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today to talk about foreign service careers. Sorry we don't have a video, but I'll try to give as much emphasis in the audio as I can. Let me start by making a couple of preliminary points. First, I want to state that I'm not speaking on behalf of the State Department of the U.S. government. I'll try to give you some factual sort of nuts and bolts information about foreign service careers, but when it comes to the subjective comments, take those as strictly personal, based on my own experiences. Second, I ought to define what I'm referring to when I use the term foreign service. When most people hear that term, they think of State Department foreign service officers doing traditional diplomatic work in U.S. embassies. But in fact, there's other agencies that employ a smaller number of people under the foreign service personnel system, which is something distinct from civil service. For example, USAID has foreign service officers that specialize in development aid. The Commerce Department has a foreign commercial service to help American business. The Agriculture Department has a foreign agricultural service that does the same for American farmers. There's some correspondents who work for organizations like the Voice of America, who work for the Broadcasting Board of Governors and are also considered foreign service. In addition to all those foreign service officers, there's over 5,000 or so foreign service specialists, financial management officers, infotech specialists, regional medical officers, and so on. And they all do really important work, but for the purposes of this seminar, I'm going to concentrate on the work that I'm most familiar with, and that is State Department foreign service officers, referred to as generalists in State Department jargon. So let me start with the good part of that. If I could have the slide that's titled FSO Careers, the Good. There's currently 7,962 of these generalist foreign service officers, to be exact. And I think the vast majority would tell you that the work they do is really interesting and meaningful. Essentially, you can think of the Foreign Service as the eyes, ears, and the voice of the United States government in its dealings with foreign countries. About 2/3 of Foreign Service officers are assigned overseas at any given time to one of our 270 or so overseas posts. And every one of these officers is assigned to one of 5 career paths. If I could have the next slide, please. There you see the FSO career tracks. The political officers, folks that analyze political developments in foreign countries, they explain and implement U.S. foreign policy to their host governments. They negotiate agreements on political issues such as overseas basing or transit rights for the U.S. military, or the language of joint statements by government leaders. Economic officers do much the same but focus on economic issues. They identify and address trade barriers that affect American businesses and provide general analyses about economic conditions overseas that affect the U.S. Public diplomacy officers engage with a wide variety of foreign audiences beyond governments to shape public perceptions about the U.S. and its foreign policies. They manage public outreach via traditional and social media, as well as educational and cultural exchanges. Consular officers are probably the most service-oriented part of the Foreign Service. They apply U.S. immigration law to decide whether or not to issue non-immigrant visas to people who want to visit the U.S. for business or tourism, or immigrant visas to people who want to settle here permanently. They also support American citizens abroad by helping out with medical emergencies, evacuations, assisting Americans who are arrested, and issuing travel advisory warnings. And finally, management officers keep our embassies running by supporting the operations of the State Department and the 30 or so other government agencies that operate from our embassies. And that can be a huge job. For example, when I was in Rome as the Deputy Chief of Mission, or Deputy Ambassador at our embassy, the management officer had to keep a multi-million-dollar operation that was spread across 7 Italian cities and employed around 900 people running efficiently. All of those career paths enjoy the same fairly decent, if unremarkable, salaries and good federal benefits. I know people are interested in this, so I'll mention that at the bottom of the scale, a Foreign Service officer without a graduate degree and no professional experience starts off at about $46,000 a year. The other end of the scale, a senior Foreign Service officer at the very pinnacle of this pay scale can make around $180,000 a year. And those salaries, particularly for the lower ranked officers, really aren't particularly generous for officers assigned to Washington, D.C., which is a very high-cost area. You know, $46,000 doesn't take you very far in a city where the average rental for a 2-bedroom apartment is around $19,000 a year. But that base salary can be significantly augmented for people serving overseas. When you're on overseas assignment as a FSO, a Foreign Service officer, the U.S. government will either provide housing or pay a housing allowance. And for those assigned to foreign posts where the cost of living is a lot higher than in the U.S., there's also a cost of living allowance paid. And in addition, probably more than half of our overseas posts now receive a hardship allowance, ranging from 5 to 35% base salary, depending on how tough the post is. And that's compensation for living conditions that are considerably worse than in the United States, due to crime or unhealthy conditions or isolation. And then finally, there's about 15, 20 countries where danger pay is authorized, with allowances of 15 to 35% of base salary. So you see there's lots of augmentation when you're serving overseas. As far as benefits go, there's also subsidized health care through the Federal Health Benefits Program and a 3-tier retirement system consisting of Social Security, a Foreign Service pension, and a thrift savings plan, which is like a 401k. Those first 2 components are funded by a 7.5% deduction from your salary, and TSP is funded by your own personal contributions, some of which is matched by the government. So that's sort of the monetary compensation, but judging the real value of a Foreign Service career, I think goes beyond those material rewards. Most Foreign Service officers join up because they love experiencing and learning about other countries and cultures in a more in-depth way than they ever could as tourists. During my career, I lived in 10 different countries, and I visited about 45 others. And while I enjoyed some more than others, I found every single one fascinating in its own way. I think you'll also find that a Foreign Service career never gets too dull professionally. There's always a new challenge, and that's not least because officers take on new assignments every 2 to 4 years. Not counting the time spent in training, I had a dozen different assignments dealing with 5 different continents during my Foreign Service career, ranging from work with issuing visas in the Caribbean, to being a foreign policy advisor to the U.S. Air Force and the Pentagon, to ambassador in Brunei, Dar es Salaam in Southeast Asia. I reported on political and economic developments, helped negotiate trade agreements, military access rights, and took on dozens of other tasks as necessary. So if you like the constant challenge of having to adjust to new environments and take on new responsibilities, and never getting bored or complacent, I think the Foreign Service might be right for you. There's a lot of good to be had in a Foreign Service career. That said, there's also a fair amount of not so good, or maybe even bad. Maybe I can take the next slide when it's headed FSO careers, the bad. First off, it's hard to get into the Foreign Service. There's a very elaborate multi-step entry process. It starts with the Foreign Service Officer Test, a written test that runs over 3 hours and is usually given 3 times a year at Pearson testing centers across the U.S., also overseas in a rotating list of 18 or so foreign countries. You've got to be an American citizen over the age of 20 to take the test, and you have to decide which of those 5 career tracks I talked about you want to pursue before you actually take it. It consists of 3 multiple choice sections that cover job knowledge to a broad range of topics, and that includes the workings of the U.S. government and American and world history and culture. There's also an English expression section and a situational judgment section that presents scenarios you might encounter as a foreign service officer. Finally, there's also a 4th section, an essay section on an assigned topic. Most people don't pass the written test on the first try, but you can take it as many times as you want, as long as you wait 12 months between each attempt. In recent years, some 17,000, 20,000 people, somewhere in that range, have taken the written test each year. And if you pass that written test, you'll be asked to submit a personal narrative that gives you an opportunity to provide positive examples of your accomplishments and the skills you bring to the table. And that narrative, along with your educational work background and scores from the written test, are then reviewed by a qualified evaluation panel made up of trained foreign service officers from the career track you choose. And the best and qualified applicants will then be invited to an oral assessment. The actual numbers every year depend on projected hiring needs for that year. But usually those who are invited to the oral assessment number maybe in the hundreds. If I could have the slide that says FSO selection process. That gives you a summary of what I've talked about already. And then if you pass that oral assessment halfway down that list, which is conducted primarily in Washington, but in some years is also done in San Francisco. A bit more about that. That's a day-long exercise that consists of a group exercise, a structured interview, and a case management writing exercise. And it's designed to measure the 13 dimensions that have been identified as essential for foreign service officers. You can find all of them on the website I'll give you later, but they include things like cultural adaptability, initiative and leadership, ability to work with others, and so on. Then if you make it through that oral assessment, you'll be given a conditional offer of employment with emphasis on the word conditional. You've still got to pass medical clearances and get a security clearance based on a comprehensive background investigation. Something called a suitability review panel will then review all your materials except for privileged medical information to confirm that you meet the standards of integrity and reliability required of foreign service officers. So then if you go through all that, you'll finally get offered a job as a foreign service officer, right? Wrong. Even after all that, your name is placed on a hiring register, rank ordered within the career track you've chosen. And final job officers depend on the needs of the foreign service. Your name can stay on that register for a maximum of 18 months, but you may or may not be offered a job in that period. And if you're not offered a job after 18 months, you've got to start the whole process again. So at the end of the day, on average over the last several years, maybe 200, 300 or so new officers are hired each year from that group of 17 to 20,000 people who took the written test. And this year, the numbers are projected to be even lower, possibly only about 100 new officers. So the process can be grueling, and the odds are long. And those sort of institutional challenges don't stop once you're in the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service personnel system is not like the civil service, which offers many employment protections with compensation based on the job you fill at any given time. Instead, the Foreign Service system is modeled on the military rank and person system, with a career track based on the upper-out model. Entry-level officers are considered on a probationary appointment for 5 years until they're granted so-called tenure as a full-fledged FSO. After that, they must keep progressing in their foreign service career. It's going to come to an end. It's a complicated system, but generally, new officers come into the service at a rank equivalent to maybe a second lieutenant or a first lieutenant in the Army, or an ensign or a lieutenant JG in the Navy. And then they can be promoted in steps to the equivalent of a colonel or a Navy captain. they don't make the next grade within 10 years or so, their employment is over. And even if they do keep progressing, their career will be over after 22 years of service, unless they choose to compete for the senior foreign service, which is the equivalent of flag officers, generals, and admirals in the military. And when you consider that the average age of those entering the foreign service today is about 30 years old, it implies that many of them will be looking for new jobs in their 50s, which is not an ideal situation by any means. Even those that make that leap are then subject to further time and grade limitations unless their promotions continue within the senior foreign service. So it's kind of a Darwinian system, but it's really necessary to ensure that the organization can renew itself and doesn't become stale, has a good workflow. There's another organizational challenge, however, which in my opinion is not so defensible, and that's the layering and complications that come with being a large bureaucracy. The State Department's actually pretty small as government departments go. Only about 24,000 Americans, about 1% of total federal government employment. But that's still a large organization, and like any large organization, including in the private sector or academia, that bureaucracy can be stifling. There's lots of management layers, and there's a fairly rigid chain of command. And entrepreneurial risk-taking, I can tell you, is not always welcome with open arms. I found that to be much less true at overseas posts, where there's often a fair amount of space for innovation and taking on significant responsibility early in one's career. But in Washington, where every FSO has to serve a portion of his or her career, the bureaucracy can be a bit more overbearing. It's true, even as a lowly desk officer for some country, you might write memos that are eventually read by the Secretary of State, maybe even the President. But before they get to that level, they have to be cleared by your counterparts in a number of other offices. They have to go up the chain through your deputy office director, through your office director, a deputy assistant secretary, an assistant secretary, maybe an undersecretary, not to mention pass muster with the executive staff that ensures that memos to the principals, like the Secretary of State, are all fit in the proper format and the proper length and so on. I don't want to oversell this. I've spoken with friends who work in other large organizations, both inside and outside of government, and a lot of them face the same kind of challenges. So it's not unique to the State Department or the Foreign Service. And as I said, there's a lot more freedom for individual initiative when you serve overseas at one of our foreign posts. But I think you should be aware that if you're looking for a real, entrepreneurial atmosphere, a freewheeling environment, you may find the Foreign Service could be frustrating. I'm not sure Elon Musk could be really happy as a Foreign Service officer, although he'd be a good one. Another not so good consideration of a Foreign Service career is the flip side of the international nature of the job that I mentioned previously. The churn and the moving of a Foreign Service career can be invigorating professionally. But it's tough on families, and it's tough on personal relationships. Kids find themselves adjusting every few years not only to new schools, but sometimes to new school systems in new countries. During one stretch in the late 1980s, one of my daughters went from a German-speaking nursery school to an American kindergarten, to an international school overseas, back to one American school, then to another American elementary school in a different city, and finally to an Australian school in Western Australia, all in about 36 months. That's asking a lot of your family. And it's not just kids. It's difficult for spouses of Foreign Service officers to pursue their own careers if they're following their spouse around from assignment to assignment. Unless they've got a skill that lends itself to self-employment or telework, job opportunities for the spouses of foreign diplomats can be non-existent or severely limited. Also, if you've got parents who face elder care issues, that can be another challenge. Those types of things are difficult to handle when you live in the same town as your aging parents, let alone thousands of miles away. So that's a bit of the bad, or at least not so good part of Foreign Service careers. I've talked about the good and the bad, so let me now turn to the ugly. We could have that slide that says FSO careers, the ugly. Look, there's no getting around the fact that Foreign Service officers face physical and psychological dangers. As an American diplomat, you are a symbol of the United States of America. And therefore, you're a target of people around the world who consider America to be an enemy. You may be familiar with the name Chris Stevens, the American ambassador to Libya, who was killed in Benghazi in 2012. Maybe even the name Anne Schmadenhoff, a young public diplomacy officer who was killed by a suicide bomber in Afghanistan in 2013. You may have also heard of the apparent physical damage from some unknown source suffered by our diplomats in Cuba. But you probably don't know that around 1,000 or so Foreign Service assignments today are in places that are deemed so dangerous by the State Department that the tours are unaccompanied, meaning either that no family members can accompany the officer to post, or only adult family members and no children. Almost every Foreign Service officer can expect to serve a tour in Afghanistan, Iraq, or some other war zone. And it's not just the physical dangers of people, literally trying to shoot at you sometimes. There's also a psychological toll of these and other stressful tours. And that can lead to symptoms of PTSD, something we're more and more recognizing in the Foreign Service, just as with our military colleagues. So that's another challenge not only for Foreign Service officers, but their families. Another sort of challenge, which may not be really ugly, but is certainly ever present and bothers some people, is the reality of Foreign Service discipline, the fact that service needs supersede your personal preference. Every Foreign Service officer has to accept 3 commitments. First is worldwide availability. Although you can express a preference for your next assignment, ultimately you go where the State Department decides to send you. Second, you have to have flexibility in assignments. You may prefer one job to another, but in any given instance, you need to do what you're ordered to do. And finally, there's public support of U.S. policies. That last one is the toughest for many people. Internal policy debate in the Foreign Service isn't just tolerated, it's often encouraged as the pathway to good policy decisions. In fact, State Department may be the only government department to have a formal mechanism for expressing objections to current policy, the so-called dissent channel. But no matter how much you disagree with a policy in private, how much you argue against it within meetings within the State Department, once a decision is made to pursue that policy, as the representative of the U.S. government, you've got a duty to explain and advocate for it in public. You'll sometimes hear Foreign Service officers say, in response to questions from foreign audiences, "My government believes," or "the position of the United States is." And that's because they recognize that their job is to be a spokesperson for the U.S. government, not for themselves. If they decide that the policy that they have been asked to advance is so morally unacceptable to them that they cannot defend it, then their obligation is to resign from the Foreign Service. And people do that. They're then free to express their personal opinion, like any American citizen. But as long as they are Foreign Service officers, what they say publicly has to conform to U.S. policy. From the beginning, I said the title of this webinar was The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and the Terrific of a Foreign Service Career. So having covered the first 3, let me wind up on a positive note, the terrific. If I can have that last slide, it says, or next to last, it says FSO Careers, the Terrific. And look, I know we live in a cynical and suspicious time. And I realize that some people are going to take this next comment as corny or outdated. But the fact is that the greatest benefit I received from the Foreign Service career was the opportunity to represent the United States of America. I know our government makes mistakes, and I know it's going to continue to do so because it's made up of human beings, and human beings are fallible. But you know what? It's still a great country, and it was a privilege to represent it. Whether it was as a first tour officers telling some visa applicant who came in off the street, "I speak for the United States of America when I decide whether or not you will be permitted to travel to the U.S." Or as an ambassador telling a cabinet minister of a foreign government, "I speak for the United States of America when I ask you to support this policy initiative." It was, for me, always an inspiration and a thrill to know that I was the voice of my country overseas. It was always a rush, quite frankly, to say that I spoke for the United States of America. It was an honor and a privilege, and I would suggest that if you think you'd view it the same way, I'd urge you to consider a foreign service career. If you think you would, let me give you just a few other resources that you might tap beyond just listening to me to get more information. If I could have that slide that has additional information on it. First off, that's a website at State Department that has a lot of more in-depth detail about some of the things I talked about getting into the Foreign Service. The next bullet inside a U.S. Embassy, Diplomacy at Work, is a book put out by the American Foreign Service Association, Association of Diplomats, and it gives a good description of kind of what you actually do in an embassy day to day. It gives some snapshots of people's actual jobs and may help you get you some insight onto whether or not it's something you'd like to do. America's Other Army is a book written by a guy named Nick Kralev, a journalist who interviewed lots of diplomats, and I think gives kind of an outside perspective on the good and the bad in the Foreign Service. And finally, there's Diplomats in Residence. Diplomats in Residence, there must be probably fewer than a dozen around the U.S., are senior Foreign Service officers assigned on detail to American universities, where they teach courses and also have as part of their duties counseling people and giving information to people who might be interested in entering the Foreign Service. For example, I think the Midwest is covered by a diplomat in residence at the University of Illinois Chicago campus, who was a public diplomacy officer. So those people are available too to contact, and you can get information on which one of them is at which university and what areas they cover on the State Department website. There's an interactive map. So with that, I think we're about halfway through, so I'll just open this up for any questions or comments people want to make.
Great. We do have one question. Is there a maximum age for joining?
Yes, there is. I think it is age 50 before you can take the Foreign Service test. I will say, though, that if you're creeping up on 50, you shouldn't be discouraged by it, because the average age of entering Foreign Service officers has been going up in recent years. It is above 30 now. I think it's about 32 the last time I looked. So it is not unusual to get people who have other careers, either within government or in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, to come in at somewhere around mid-career at an age higher than was previously the case.
You spoke about the benefits that the employed person receives. What are the benefits for partners and children for healthcare or retirement, etc.?
Not as much as they should be, probably. There obviously is the benefit of being able to go and live and experience foreign countries. There are education allowances paid for kids. So if you're in a foreign country, the State Department will help make sure that your child gets a education as equivalent as possible in that country to what they would receive in the U.S., and will pay tuition, for example. As far as pensions goes, it's sort of complicated, but there is a formula for people who are married to Foreign Service officers who are retired. If those retired officers die, they get a portion of the pension for the rest of their lives. So there's some benefits there, but generally, it's tough on Foreign Service families. I don't want to whitewash it. They probably don't get as much help and support as they should, although State Department's gotten much better at that in recent years. It's still a challenge.
Another question is, what's the best way to prepare yourself for the Foreign Service? You spoke about the very arduous and grueling test, but what should people major in, or experience or skills should they seek to be best prepared?
Well, you can get some more detail about this on that State Department Careers website I put up there. But generally, I think you don't feel that there's a need to focus in on international relations or foreign affairs as a specialty. I think the best preparation you can have is to have a well-rounded view of not only history, economy, and current affairs, but just a good sense of how to think about problems. The kinds of things that, frankly, a liberal arts education like you get at the University of Chicago will probably give you. I think some people make a mistake by sort of over-concentrating on diplomatic history or international relations. Nobody in the Foreign Service Test is going to ask you what they discussed in week 3 of the Congress of Vienna. They're much more interested in your ability to think about problems, to attack issues. One way to think about it is this. The best definition of diplomacy that I ever heard is that diplomacy is the art of getting other people to do what you want by putting yourself in their shoes. So if you develop those skills of being inquisitive and curious and emphatic with people and curious about their countries, their governments, their economies, I think those are the kinds of things that will lead you to prepare well for the Foreign Service exam. Also on that website, I think I mentioned there's a list of books, things you could read, and it's all worth going through. But the real key, I think, is to have a broad intellectual curiosity and a strong analytical base when you go into it.
Someone asked, are there prep courses you could take before the exam?
There are. There is a model test you can take for the written exam, and I think you can link to that through the State Department career website. There's also private companies who do that. If you just Google Foreign Service Exam Practice Test, you'll find some of them kicking up. There are people who write blogs about how to get into the Foreign Service and what their experience was with the exam. So there's a wealth of information out there. Although I would caution you, yes, take the practice exams, get a sense of what you can expect so you're not surprised, but don't try to over-prepare. I mean, the best thing you can do is just get a good, solid, wide-ranging education, be a curious person, and walk in relaxed and ready to go. I think some people kind of have their preparation backfire on them because they get over-prepared and a little bit nervous, and then when they sit at the exam, it just falls apart on them. So don't over-prepare, but yeah, there are practice tests out there, and they're worth taking.
Someone says they're a dual citizen, so they're a citizen of the U.S. and another country. Is that a barrier for consideration for a foreign service career?
That's a good question, and I am not 100% sure of the answer. I don't think it is, since our law changed several years ago to allow dual citizenship generally for American citizens. But I think that is something you need to look at. I know there are lots of people in the Foreign Service with close family ties in other countries because their parents are recent immigrants. But I don't know for sure whether dual citizenship is permissible. So I'm sorry, you'd have to do more research on that.
You mentioned that if you aren't selected for placement during that 18-month period, and then you said that you have to start the process over. Do you mean retaking the Foreign Service exam again and going through all of the subsequent steps, or do you get to begin at a later point in the process?
No, you have to start from square one, is my understanding. You have to go back and take the written test again.
What careers do people go into after they retire from the Foreign Service?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's sort of all over the lot. A number of people have gone into academia to teach at universities. Some have gone into international businesses where they value people who have experiences with certain parts of the world and can give them insight into political or economic risk. I just saw recently that somebody who did a lot of work in the Middle East is now a ski instructor in the Rockies because that's what he always wanted to do. Myself, I took retirement seriously. I did not go for full-time work and have spent time consulting with people, consulting with organizations, excuse me. So it's really all over the lot, and then you can kind of drive it by what your personal preferences are, where you want to go. I even knew somebody who started a business selling hand-painted toy soldiers, tin soldiers. He did pretty well at it, actually. Who knew there was a market for that? But, you know, people once they get out of the Foreign Service, quite often are young enough they can still follow their muse. So it can lead anywhere.
So you talked a little bit about what happens after. What inspired you to go into the Foreign Service?
Well, I needed a job. You know, as you mentioned, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was a commuter student at the University of Chicago. I hadn't given much thought to the Foreign Service, frankly. I wasn't even sure, when I look back, I even knew what it was until I saw a notice on the bulletin board in the placement office at the university. But I pursued it because it seemed to me a way to enter into a career that would really broaden your horizons. And I mean that in many senses of the word. Broaden your horizons geographically, you know, get to see the world. Broaden your horizons as well, sort of intellectually. Think about things that you might not have to think about otherwise. Force yourself to really work at it and work for something bigger than yourself. Work for the benefit of the United States. So those kinds of things all appeal to me. To be totally honest, though, I entered the Foreign Service after getting an MBA at the university. I thought that I would do it for a few years, look good on the resume, and then go on to, you know, back to the real world and get some corporate job. But I found that it was so much to my liking, and I seem to have an aptitude for it, that those few years turned into over 3 decades, and I don't regret them one bit.
What country did you enjoy living in the most?
Oh, Italy was great to live in, but I think I really enjoyed Australia. I was the Consul General in Perth in Western Australia, which is the American Foreign Service post furthest away from Washington, D.C., which may have added to parts of my enjoyment. But it was just also a great place. And it just came at a good time in our lives, where we had a nice place to live, the housing was good, the job was fascinating as a responsible position. We met good friends, our kids met good friends. In fact, we just had a visit a couple weeks ago from friends we met all those years ago in the 1990s in Australia, who we keep in good touch with. We've been back on private trips. It was just a place that I almost consider a second home.
So speaking of the different countries you've lived in, what was your shortest placement and your longest placement?
Well, the shortest was in Kuwait and Baghdad. I was in Kuwait with my family in 1990 when the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And that was only a year into my tour. I actually went there on a 2-year tour, and because it was a hardship post, the tours were a little bit shorter. But we liked it so much we'd put in the stay for a 3rd year. And then after we'd been there, I guess it was about 13 months, the Iraqis invaded. And as the 3rd ranking officer at the embassy, I was given the responsibility of trying to take a evacuation convoy of American diplomats through Iraqi lines, first to Baghdad and then on to Jordan. based on assurances that Saddam had given us that we'd be able to go through safely. Well, we got as far as Baghdad, and those assurances were taken away. Basically, he double-crossed us, said we couldn't go any further until the U.S. made certain political concessions to him, which we weren't going to do. So we were stuck in Baghdad, essentially as hostages. I became the acting deputy chief of mission at our embassy in Baghdad then for, I guess that would have been about 4 months. And those were my shortest tours, but perhaps my most intense ones. The longest tour I had was in Vienna, Austria, and that went 4 years. And that was fine, although I have to say that I'm not a big proponent of those longer tours. While we had a very comfortable life in Vienna, you know, after about 3 years, you start losing your edge. You know, I can see that I was starting to look at things as, oh, well, we tried that a few years ago and it didn't work. And that's not a good attitude to have. You got to stay fresh. So I think the longest tour being 4 years taught me that that's probably around the maximum for really being an effective American diplomat.
And what type of support is there, as you're talking about your time in Baghdad and in Kuwait? So what type of support is there offered for officers who are serving overseas? So, for example, psychological support, social support, whatever you can think of.
Well, I mentioned some of the monetary allowances, and those are welcome. But I think more important is some of the, as you said, psychological support, not only for the officer, but for the family. To be totally honest with you, back when I went through the Iraq War in 1990, the support ranged from non-existent to lousy. Since then, though, the State Department has gotten a lot better at it. So there's support available for families, also for officers overseas. We have regional psychiatrists that will help out when people are feeling mental stresses. There are programs to address issues when people show symptoms of PTSD. There's attempts to help people understand what they're going to expect when they come back from a high-intensity war zone into sort of everyday life. And it's a tough adjustment, I can tell you. Families get, there's some available counseling, both formal, official, and also informal. There's networks that spring up now with the availability of social media among spouses who are separated from their officer spouses. And they, you know, they do some pretty good stuff. They really give each other not only tips on how to survive, but sort of mental support. I found that one of the most important things to support me and help me get through the really high stress instances, I mean, you know, instances where I never knew if I was going to get out and see my family again, was to have somebody tell me what you're going through isn't unusual. Yes, you may be showing signs of depression. You may be showing signs of PTSD. But you know what? If you didn't in this high stress situation, there'd probably be something wrong with you. So it's not unusual, and here's how you can deal with it. And that gives you so much strength to be able to face what you're dealing with. Hard to, you know, deal with at first because the Foreign Service attracts a lot of type A individuals who think they can handle anything. And then you find yourself needing help. And sometimes it's tough to admit that, but I think the State Department and the informal networks that have sprung up among State Department officers and spouses do a much better job at that now than they did, say, 15 years ago. You know, I should add to that, Rachel, that part of that is because there's so many people who have had such tough experiences. I mean, you know, probably around 90% of the State Department officers have served in a hardship post. You have to go to a hardship post at some point. And large number have served in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last decade plus. So, you know, there's more and more need for that kind of support. And I think that need has spurred some of the supply. as I said, states doing a better job of supporting those people.
That's great to hear. Another question came in is, how is maternity leave handled for foreign service members who are women?
I do not know the details of that right now. There is family leave. I couldn't tell you how long it lasts, not only for maternal leave, but also for paternal leave. People are entitled to taking a certain amount of time off. I will tell you that women who are in places where the medical care is not considered up to standard, the State Department is pretty good at financing what's called medevacs, medical evacuations. So people can either give birth in other countries or come back to the U.S. Nobody asks you to sit in some place where you're going to put your or your baby's life in danger. So there are benefits there. For the details, you'd have to check the website. I don't have them right in my head or at hand. But, there's consideration. It's probably ahead of the private sector in some ways.
Yeah, that's great. So we've touched on this a little bit, but can you think of any interesting cultural experiences or anecdotes from your time on these 5 different continents you served on?
Well, lots of interesting cultural experiences. I can tell you from having spent 3 years in Italy that you could probably get pretty fluent in Italian and spoken Italian in a few years, but I think it would take decades to become fluent in Italian hand gestures. I made a dent in that in 3 years. I think you find a lot of misconceptions about the U.S. I remember when I was in Brunei, a fairly senior person who had I think it was a niece who went off to the U.S. And I happened to see him and said, she went to be a college student. I said, how's your niece doing? And he said, oh, terrific. She got on the phone with us the other day. She said she's been there for 3 weeks. She hasn't seen anybody get shot. She hasn't seen a single robbery. And I thought, well, of course not. I mean, Americans go through their whole lives without that happening. But then I thought, what do people see in some of these countries about the U.S.? If you look at international cable channels, it's Law and Order and, crime shows and reality shows about awful murders and things that are happening. I mean, you'd be surprised at the perception people have of what a violent, lawless, vicious country this is. And when they get here and they find that there's actually nice people living decent lives, sometimes it kind of surprises them. So that was a cultural bit of a shock I had to get over. People's perceptions of the U.S. are certainly different than what we would think they might be.
Was there ever anything you were really homesick for, a product or something you really wanted when you were serving overseas, but couldn't find or with great difficulty had to find?
Well, it used to be that way in the Foreign Service, but it's become such a globalized world now that, I don't know, are there any countries you still can't get peanut butter? For example, there used to be lots of them, but now you can search those kinds of things out, or you can order online and have it sent via the diplomatic mail service. So I think that really that's not too much of an issue anymore. Products or individual things, what's more of an issue is sort of the lifestyles. For example, people will look at Foreign Service and say, oh, what a great deal. You got assigned a 2-bedroom house as a young officer in some country. Well, that's great until you realize that the 2-bedroom house is maybe next to a cement plant that's spewing out unregulated pollution, or nearby a swamp, and you've got to worry about, as we did in our careers, we had cobras in a lawn in one place. We had nasty lizards in another place. There's a lot of places overseas that aren't as comfortable as we're used to in the U.S. And I think that's the bigger cultural challenge, just to kind of look at it and say, all right, am I going to fight this and try to build a little America out here, insulate myself from the country around me, or am I going to deal with it? Am I going to try to take the good and mitigate the bad, and really sort of get into and understand the place I'm in? I think people who take that latter course end up having a much more enriching career.
Yeah, it sounds like you took some of that course.
Yeah, and live to tell the tale, but only barely in some cases.
Well, my final question for you would be, what is the biggest misconception people have about careers in the Foreign Service that you want to dispel on this webinar for us today?
Boy, that's a good question. You know, I think that the biggest misconception is that there is somehow a disconnect between what diplomats do and what happens in everyday life for the average American. You know, people look at it and say, well, what does that have to do with me? Well, it has a lot to do with you. I mean, if you fly to some other country on a vacation, you're able to do that because diplomats somewhere have negotiated bilateral air agreements. If you can do that fairly safely, it's because diplomats somewhere are coordinating very closely with their counterparts to exchange information on counterterrorism and how to keep air traffic safe, for example. If you work at a job where people sell things, where your company sells things overseas, it's because diplomats negotiated an agreement somewhere to open that market. So there's things that people in the Foreign Service do every day that touch the lives of average Americans. And they do it in tough circumstances, and it's necessary. It's kind of hard to sell. It's kind of hard to talk about because, you know, you point at someplace and say, look what's happening there between those two countries. And the answer is nothing. And you say, exactly. That's because we diplomats went out there and prevented a conflict from blowing up that could draw the U.S. in or negatively affect U.S. interests. But, you know, it's sort of difficult to paint that picture to people. I can tell you that I do a lot of speaking to military audiences, to military officers, about how to coordinate diplomacy and military power. And they have a tremendous, tremendous appetite for that because they realize that the diplomatic dimension of power for the United States is just as important, if not more important, than the military dimension. And if we don't work together and coordinate the two of them, something's missing. They realize how important what diplomats do is not only to sort of grand policy issues, but to the everyday safety, security, and prosperity of the American people. And so I think that's probably the biggest misconception that I wish I had a better handle on overcoming, that what diplomats do is somehow a rarefied profession that doesn't touch the average American. It touches the average American every day in lots of ways, and that's part of the reason it's so rewarding a career.
All right, I'm going to ask one last quick question, which is, how often do people ask you if you were a spy?
Oh, often. In fact, when I was assigned in East Germany, the East German government ran a cover magazine in West Germany that purported to out spies, and it claimed that I was a CIA officer. I was not. I am not. But that kind of dogged me my whole career. And, you know, what can you do? If people are just super suspicious, you can't get them to look the other way. I used to tell people that, no, my benefits aren't as good. My salary and my benefits aren't as good as those guys get. That's how I can prove that I'm not a spy.
Well, we're so thankful that you were able to join us today and share all of your insights about the Foreign Service and some of your stories from being a diplomat. So I just want to extend a very warm thank you to you again. And thank you to everyone else who is on this call. I know folks have said they appreciate your professionalism and your willingness to share, and it's very helpful in their career discernment. So thank you. For those who are listening, I invite you to join us again on May 3rd. We're going to hear from Alderman Amaya Pawar of Chicago, who was recently a gubernatorial primary candidate here in the state of Illinois and represents the Chicago's 47th Ward. And check out our other webinars that are coming up all summer long. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.
Can you still hear me, Rachel?